I am reading this morning from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. This is why it's necessary for us to pay more attention to what we have heard, or else we may drift away from it. If the message that was spoken by angels was reliable, and every offense and act of disobedience received an appropriate consequence, how will we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? It was first announced through the Lord, and then it was confirmed by those who heard him. God also vouched for their message with signs, amazing things, various miracles, and gifts from the Holy Spirit, which were handed out the way he wanted. God didn't put the world that is coming, the world we're talking about, under the angels' control. Instead, someone declared somewhere, "What is humanity that you think about them?" Or, "What are human beings that you care about them?" For a while you made them lower than angels. You crowned human beings with glory and honor. You put everything under their control. When he puts everything under their control, he doesn't leave anything out of control. But right now, we don't see everything under their control yet. However, we do see the one who was made lower in order than the angels for a little while. It's Jesus. He's the one who is now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of his death. He suffered death so that we could taste death for everyone through God's grace. It was appropriate for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, to use experiences of suffering to make perfect the pioneer of salvation. This salvation belongs to many sons and daughters whom he's leading to glory. This is because the one who makes people holy and the people who are being made holy all come from one source. That is why Jesus isn't ashamed to call them brothers and sisters when he says, "I will publicly announce your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the middle of the assembly."
Thank you, Sharon. So as many, if not most of you are well aware by now, next Sunday is our annual meeting. And so also, as I'm guessing many of you are aware, in order to fulfill the requirements of our bylaws, the official announcement of that meeting needs to be read during worship on the 2 Sundays before that. Okay? So, just as I did last Sunday, I'll take care of that, and I think I'll do it now. The annual meeting of the congregation of Sanibel Congregational United Church of Christ will be conducted at approximately 11:15 a.m. on Sunday, January 28th, 2024, in the Fellowship Hall of Sanibel Congregational United Church of Christ, in person and on Zoom. There. Oh, who are we kidding? Why bother? Why bother with an annual meeting? Why bother with any of this? Why bother with all the time and effort and expense that has gone into renovating and rebuilding Fellowship Hall and our sanctuary and as much of the rest of the church campus as possible? For that matter, why bother coming here to worship together on Sunday morning? Why bother to be a part of this particular spiritual community as a member or a friend, or a guest. I mean, really, why bother to be part of this Christian spiritual tradition at all? Why bother in this time when more and more people, particularly in our nation, this society, this culture, consider themselves, identify themselves as either nuns, and I don't mean N-U-N-S, nuns, N-O-N-E-S, belonging to no religious tradition, or that ever popular spiritual but not religious. Why bother with any of this in this time when more and more people in this nation, our society, our culture, seem to see us and what we do as being of less and less significance, of less and less consequence? Believe that we matter less and less. Why bother? And it seems like a fair question, but it's also far from a new one. It is far from a new one for those of us in the Christian spiritual tradition. In fact, it is a question that goes all the way back to the beginning. Just a generation after Jesus' death and resurrection, many members of the early Christian community find themselves experiencing increasing levels of anxiety and fear. Some even falling into despair. Anxious, fearful, falling into despair as they experience greater and greater levels of imprisonment, confiscation of their property at the hands of the Roman authorities, and increasing levels of suspicion, ridicule, and hostility from the wider cultures that they reside in. A set of circumstances that has led many of them to ask, why bother? Why bother to continue on this Christian spiritual path when the authorities and so many around us see us as having little consequence, of being of little significance at best, and at worst, see us as a threat for our odd ways, threat for our odd ways of refusing to venerate the emperor as a god, of disregarding economic and social classifications and divisions, of insisting on full equality and the sharing of resources. Why bother? Seeing all this, an early, unknown Christian leader writes a letter. The letter that we know as the letter to the Hebrews, the letter that Sharon read from. It's a bit of a misnomer, because the letter is written to the entire Christian community throughout the Roman Empire, a community which consisted of both Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, as we have discussed before. Scholars believe that it got that official name later on simply because of the writer's clear expertise and frequent references to the Hebrew Scriptures throughout. It's also a bit of a misnomer for many scholars in that It's not so much a letter as it is a sermon, a message, a theologically and biblically and spiritually wide-ranging and very, very long sermon. But a sermon which has one vital core purpose: to reinvigorate the spiritual flame that the writer sees flickering and at risk of being extinguished in so many members of that early Christian community. And the writer, the preacher, really, the preacher does that in a number of different ways throughout the letter. But to my mind, none more important than by reminding his people of their story. Reminding them of their story. In the part of the letter, the sermon that Sharon shared with us, the preacher begins by reminding his people of the source of that story. It's a continuation of the theme that this preacher opens the sermon up with in the chapter before this. The preacher reminds his people, reminds us of the source of their story: God and the Jesus who embodied that God. This is why it's necessary, the preacher says, for us to pay more attention to what we have heard through God and the Jesus who embodies him. The preacher reminds them that if what God said to them through prophets and angels mattered, then how much more should what God said to them through Jesus matter? And then the preacher moves into what, for me, is the heart of the story. Drawing on the Hebrew Scriptures, the Psalms, the 8th Psalm specifically, that the preacher is so familiar with. He says, what is humanity? What is humanity that you, meaning God, are mindful of them? That you care about them? That you made them just a little less than angels, a little less divine than angels for a while? That you have clothed them in glory and honor, and that you have put all things under their control. Meaning here, as it means in the Hebrew Scriptures, that we are invited by God to be partners with God as caretakers of all that is. What is humanity? What are we that God is mindful of us, thinks about us, cares about us, that we matter to God enough to have been created a little less divine than angels, to be clothed with glory and honor, and to be invited to be partners with God in caring for all that is. Partners with God in helping to bring about, as the preacher puts it, the world that is coming. Another way of saying the world coming into union with God and God's ways. That, the preacher tells his people and tells us, is the heart of their story. A story with eternal consequences that they are invited to be a part of. The circumstances are different for us But the reality is the same. In this time, many people are also experiencing increasing levels of anxiety and fear. Increasing numbers of people are falling into despair in this time. The data is clear. Even if we factor out the months and years of COVID isolation and restrictions, research demonstrates that in recent times there has been a significant increase in the amount of anxiety and fear that people in this nation, in this society, in this culture are experiencing on a regular basis. An increase, a significant increase in what medical experts, what the literature refers to as deaths of despair. Deaths from suicide and narcotic overdoses, particularly now opioids, deaths related to all kinds of other substance abuse, deaths of despair. And of course, for any phenomenon like that, we know that the factors involved in giving rise to it are many. It is complex. But at the same time, many medical and mental health experts agree that the significant rise in these things is at least in part, if not great part, related to the struggle that so many people in our culture now have trying to find real meaning and purpose in their lives. Trying to believe sincerely that they and their lives are of consequence, are of significance, that they, to use the term coined by the late sociologist Morris Rosenberg, matter. That they matter. And while, again, that phenomenon is complex, that there are also many different factors that can help give rise to it. The journalist and author and social commentator Rebecca Solnit, echoing the thoughts of philosophers and psychologists and spiritual leaders through the ages, believes that that sense, that lack of a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, in so many people's lives, is at least in part, if not great part, grounded in and reinforced by the life stories that individuals and the society they are a part of choose to claim for their own. And let's get real. There are some really lousy stories out there. Some really lousy stories calling out to us, enticing us, clamoring for us to claim them for our own. Just some of the highlights of the Lousy Story album. 1. Okay. 1. You are only as worthy as your worth. You are only as worthy as your wealth, or your stuff, or your power, or your fame, or your prestige. We are our own God. The idea that we are or should be our sole, final, moral and ethical authority. No, thank you. At least for me. No, thank you. And as we know, history is littered with the carnage stemming from that story. You can have it all. No, you can't. Who says? Reality says. And besides, borrowing the classic line from the comedian Stephen Wright, where would you put it? And then this one. We are the masters of our own destiny. Yeah, no, we're not. Of course, we should take and be responsible for the things that we can in our lives. Of course we should. But the reality is that life and the world are just way too complex and complicated and interconnected for us to really ever be the master of much of anything. And if you've ever lived with a cat, I need say no more. The world is full of lousy stories. But the one that the preacher reminds his people of, the one that the preacher says is their story and therefore our story too, a story of a God who thinks about us, that we are the people of a God who is mindful of us, that cares about us, the story of a God who has made us a little bit less than angels for just a while. The story of a God who has crowned us with glory and honor. The story of a God who has called us to be partners in the world that is coming. What is essentially a story about the salvation of all that is. Well, that story is not one of them. It's not one of them. A couple of years ago, Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin published a peer-reviewed study in which they shared that participants who were actively involved in a religious community, okay, active religious participants, were found to have a much greater sense of meaning and purpose in their lives than those who considered themselves either nuns or spiritual but not religious. That finding was not a huge surprise to the researchers. What was a huge surprise to them was that the social aspect of belonging to a religious community, which they in advance were quite certain would end up being the most important factor in that sense of meaning and purpose, wasn't. It wasn't. By far the most important factor in that sense of meaning and purpose that those religious participants felt and sensed in their lives was that they believed they were part of something much greater and grander and more important than themselves or anything else. That they were part of a story with eternal consequences. That they were part of a better story. In May of 2022, in fact, the day after you called me to be your next senior minister, the day after, I headed out to the preaching conference that I go to every year, week-long preaching conference. Okay? You're probably wondering when that's actually going to help. And every year, I come away with at least a couple of really memorable moments. That particular year, one of those was a presentation that a minister gave on how to give shorter sermons. Don't get excited. Because it was a Baptist minister who was talking about how to go from an hour-long sermon to a 45-minute one. So you're welcome. But the most memorable moment of all was when at the end of her sermon, a sermon that was essentially about the impact, the importance of Christianity as a buffer to the anxiety and the fear and the despair that society and culture in this time can engender. The minister and author Nadia Bolz-Weber said this: Christianity still matters because we have a better story. Christianity still matters because we have a better story. Yes, my friends. Yes, we do. So why bother? Why bother with any of this? Why bother with all of this? That's why. The annual meeting of the congregation of Sanibel Congregational United Church of Christ will be conducted at approximately 11:15 a.m. on Sunday, January 28th, 2024, in Fellowship Hall of Sanibel Congregational United Church of Christ, in person and on Zoom. Amen.